much. It's great to be here. My name's Nathan. Today, we're going to be talking about managing design systems from features and releases to roadmaps and backlogs. It's time to dig into process. This is really exciting for me because I love geeking out, like she said, on these kinds of things. And it's also just nice to be here in Brighton. I appreciate being invited to come speak. And I'm from Fairfax, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. If you know Dulles Airport, I can hear the planes that are really heavy going across to here in England. I've worked on a lot of design systems for about 20 years or so. My first one was Sun.com. If you remember Sun.com, rest in peace, Sun. They had lots of servers and Java and other kinds of things that they used to do. As she mentioned, you can find me on Medium as well as LinkedIn and Twitter, socializing with folks like you. My company, Directed Edges, is very much like, if you've heard before, H-Shapes, where I do a lot of consulting with different teams through office hours and special projects and embedding as a leader on the design system program for clients. And that's where I learn and see a lot of the patterns that I can share with you, because at my core, I like the label design system architect. It's sort of a fusion of those two roles. And I love, despite, I'm going to call Ben Callahan, who I also adore, I love design tokens and UI components. So if you caught him at the end of his talk, he was like, design token naming, crafting really great UI components, it doesn't matter. I actually think it does. And we're going to talk a lot about that. So Ben, I appreciate all of your ideas too. You're awesome. But also, I'm a design systems architect that ends up managing a lot of the work. And so I'm actually not going to talk about any token names or UI component properties today in this talk, but instead I'm going to talk about my role on design system teams. And so I'm kind of a product manager, I'm kind of a project manager, but I don't really care what I'm called. I'm really more focused on what am I responsible for. And so a person coming from the design who's done a lot of development in my career, I end up finding myself in this role managing the work. And so what does that mean? I have to think about the strategy, ensure quality, deliver the releases, make sure the workflows are being managed, prioritizing roadmap and fostering collaboration, all those stakeholders and team members that I'm trying to develop. There's lots of other things beyond the tokens and the components. And so what I'm going to share with you today is trying to answer, how does that work? Literally, on a day-to-day basis, what are the main things we're doing? And one of the main questions that we're trying to answer, and it's a mouthful, is how are we supposed to produce features in a workflow that includes tasks like we plan the thing, we design the thing, we spec the thing, we code the thing, we produce a published Figma asset, and we have design and code libraries, we have releases and initiatives and roadmaps and all these task management boards, and that's really going to be the outline. And I'm going to whiz through a lot of different, or I don't know if that, I'm going to fly through whatever, a lot of these different topics, and we're going to go down one by one to talk about them. And as I do that, starting with defining what I mean by a feature, I'm going to share a lot of screenshots. There's a lot of detail. Don't worry, I'll share the slides later. But I hope you can extract ways of connecting with your teammates and structuring your work to deliver more efficiently. So let's talk about features. In design systems, we produce a lot of stuff: design tokens, components, patterns, content guidance, as well as all of our workflow processes and training curriculums and strategy and plans and analytics. And so today, I'm going to focus on really what I call features. These are the things on the left. And I'm not going to really focus on how we create all the processes. I'm just going to show you the processes that we have or that I install at various clients that I work with. And so whether we like it or not, developing those features and delivering those things over time gobbles up a lot of the resource capacity that we have on our teams. I work with teams that are composed of lots of designers and developers and writers and occasionally accessibility specialists and researchers and other kinds of specialists too. And so our work to deliver those features is a lot of the investment of time, which means a lot of the investment of the money that we get as a program to run the system. And so when I use the term feature, this is not the most important takeaway of the slide, but it's something that we make, we document, and we release as a system asset because other people are going to use it. And so it's often published in, hopefully, more than one library. It's useful to designers or developers or other people. And it's usually implicitly or explicitly going to be a thing that's versioned. We might change it over time. And so we produce those features through a workflow. And I'm going to walk you through the steps of that workflow with the context if you just want to put your mind's eye in this. Maybe it's an alert component or a breadcrumb component. It doesn't really matter. It's a component that you need to deliver, as an example. And when you think about design systems, everybody that I talked to talks about it as a highly, hopefully, a fusion of design to code. And wouldn't it be nice if the steps of our process were designed to code? If you had just 2 steps and all you had to do was assign a designer to do the design and a developer to do the code, wouldn't it be nice if it was that simple? Because in a lot of product workflows, it kind of feels like that sometimes. But as I've evolved this process over time, I started working with teams and expanding this workflow. And my work with Discovery in 2016, gosh, that's 8 years ago now, we started to realize that the production and approval of the design was not the same moment as the production and approval of the documentation, the use whens, the do don'ts, all that kind of stuff that followed deciding what the design was. And so they are separate tasks that we needed to track the work of those 2 things. As I worked with Morningstar from 2017 to 2018, we also put something before design because we wanted to protect ourselves to understand what we were working on. We called it the discover step at the time, where we were doing scope and auditing things, and I'll talk more about that. And as this process evolved further, I worked with Target. They actually had a longer set of steps, and you can see it got more and more complicated. And this was because, in part, accessibility, separate team, a ton of different accessibility people we could depend on, but it was an external person in our process that we put right after code so that they could look at both the design and the code and get it approved. Nothing went out unless it went through that approval process. The other thing was that at the end of the process, Giuliano, the designer on the team, was like, I'm so tired of the code evolving all the architecture of the properties and how that all worked. I don't want to go back into my then sketch files and make all those changes. I need a step to do that later on. And this is the first point that the process that I worked within separated the approval of the design from the approval and finishing of the asset that other designers reuse. And so that was an important separation of those things. Then I worked with REI, a retail company in the United States that sells hiking and other kind of outdoor equipment and events. And I came in and they were like, we read your Medium article, it's so awesome. We have a process with 10 steps. Their enthusiasm was palpable. And I was like, oh my God, 10 steps, tell me about what you're doing here. And really it was interesting how they started to add some new things too. They actually added a production step at the beginning where they wanted to have us, they separated the step of get the design approved with all of our designers from produce all the artifacts to clarify what we need from the developers that are going to be building the system assets and code. Another thing was in their process, they had a separate person responsible for doing the testing of the UI component that was made. And they had an extensive list of different kinds of testing scripts and all kinds of things they needed to write, also that went through its own review cycle. And so from that perspective, it made a lot of sense to separate testing from coding, even though most of the time we don't in this process. And so since then, we sort of settled on, from around 2020, a pretty typical array of steps. And a couple things that I take away from this are, first, the separation of what I'll call design, the series of steps of what we now most of the time call plan, that gives way to design, that gives way to spec, from production. And so that kind of moment, the separation of design and production, is important. The other thing is, notice there's a forking into 4 different produced outputs. And so it's not designed to code, it's designed to production. And those 4 different outputs on bigger teams are assigned to 4 different people. And so from a management perspective, it's important for me to make sure that that handoff moment is going to split it across all 4 of them. And so I think about potential assignees, what are the kind of roles that are typically assigned certain tasks. Design is always assigned to a designer, unless it's kind of a content-ish kind of thing, and maybe that needs to be assigned to what would be colored a green content person, but most of the time it's always a designer. But the plan step, it might be a tech spike that a developer does. It might be a sort of broader planning step that someone like me is serving in this product manager role is going to do. And then later on, is it going to be the developer or a writer doing the code docs? Is it a designer or a writer doing the design docs? The most important thing to me as a manager, directly responsible individual. I do not want tasks in my Asana or Jira that I don't know who is accountable to get the work done. And so that, for me, is essential. We think about the outputs that they're going to produce, and they're pretty typical. While a lot of the design outputs are in Figma, they take different structures, and we have different expectations of formats for what you're going to do in design versus the spec versus design docs. And so that kind of thing is important to also help people prepare for when they do the task the first time. I also care about when are we done. I talked about for the design step, it's when it's approved by other design stakeholders, maybe leadership, maybe the design community. The spec is done, though, when we've handed off not to the developer, but to all 4 production assignees, and we have a provisional agreement on what the props and the names and the elements and all that kind of stuff are going to be. And then me as a person managing the workflow, I care when all those different things are done and ready to release. They sometimes finish at different moments. Usually the design doc is happening later than the Figma asset, but it doesn't have to be that way. I care more about how are they all coming back to Converge so they're ready to be released. And so over time, I've been monitoring how much does it cost? How much time should I expect it to take? And it depends on the scope of the component. Like a little, let's say, a progress stepper or a modal is going to be a lot more expensive than some other simpler component, presumably. But there are also per step some things I'm seeing. With specification, oh my gosh, can we make that cost less? Because it sucks designer souls. Like they don't like to prepare it unless you're me, because like I geek out on that stuff. But like we can automate some of those things. But code continues to get more expensive, particularly across multiple frameworks, because what we're making is more sophisticated. And Figma assets in a similar way, the stronger the tool gets, the more we can put into it, the better the experience we can create for designers that use it, but it also is going to cost more. But tools like zeroheight in particular have made design docs easier because the authoring process and the structure by which we can anticipate the content we need to make, and it will make that step less costly. But be careful, don't spend too much time authoring a bunch of docs if you have one other teammate that you can talk to all the time. And so making sure you manage your time well to get the right benefit out of each of these steps is important. I also think about not just the assignee, but I think about the reviewers too. And it's important for me as a person managing the workflow to ensure the broad participation, not just in later steps, but also in the planning steps. So there's visibility that developers have, that writers have, that designers have in terms of the direction we're going. And even from a designer perspective, a designer that's going to be assigned the design step, but also the other designer that's typically the person building the Figma assets, because they're different people on many of the teams I work with. And so also it's important for me to make sure I'm engaging multidisciplinary, cross-functional reviews on all of the other production steps too. It matters that a designer is going to see the code docs because that's a thing that's often used by designers, and they see examples in there. What's the sample content of a particular example made by a code variant or what have you. So let's dig into some of the tasks like the plan. The purpose of the plan step, sometimes it's called propose or discover or something like that, is to understand what we're going to make, why are we going to make it, and if it's worth it to put it in the design system. Always that, for a new component, that includes the designer looking at other design systems. It includes that designer looking across the ecosystem of all the products and seeing if people are making that thing already. But maybe it includes a design exploration or a code spike or other research, but not always. The purpose here is so that we can answer questions and understand the scope. And so in Asana, there's a template that we have to highlight what questions do we need to answer in design. Can we just rough out what kind of elements this thing's going to have in its anatomy? What kind of hooks do you expect it to have in props? This can be a 30 to 60-minute conversation that we facilitate. But notice it's in Asana. So I'm making that visible. I have it in a place that everybody else knows they can refer to that later on in the process. But at the end of the plan step, the whole purpose from a workflow perspective is, are we going to make this thing? Because if not, that's it. There's no further tasks. Can we still communicate that to the stakeholders that we're asking for it or potentially impacted by it? But if it is, we're going to pursue it, then we still communicate it. The scope is formalized, and then we're assigning all the remaining tasks. We're making sure we're getting a sense for where we're going to release the thing, and then we can get started or continue on with design that might have already started, frankly. And so that design process is something that enables us to fully explore and validate the design solution. And typically people are iterating in Figma to do these kinds of steps. One of the things I like to do is think about the arc of work within a single step. How you get started, how you make something, how you need to test what you've made, how you need to share it with a bunch of other people to get a lot of feedback and iterative progress on what you've made, and then ultimately the more formal review at the end before you deliver something. Now, I'm not expecting you to read all the different kinds of things that you would do within a design step, but this kind of structure gives you a good set of hooks to think through thoroughly, like what does it take to get design done? And as you think through all of those potential things, you can start to also compare for design systems the work that a typical product designer is going to do. Because typical product designers, if you look at that make column, they're not necessarily responsible for thinking through every behavior and every state this component's ever going to do. They need to ship their product, and so they do a subset of those things. They might not care at all about looking at examples of their component they're designing locally and how it's going to work in everybody else's stuff. But for designers on systems work, we have to care about that stuff. But it goes both ways. Like, we're really thorough in design systems. We're really proud of our quality. But how many of you are usability testing every single component every time you change it when you put it into your production and you release it? And so there are things that go both ways, and so you have to think about helping people understand the different nature of the work and helping them respect the fact that you have to check certain things or they have to check certain things to get it done. When we get to that point when you near the handoff and you're producing specification or a design spec or simply spec, that tends to be a document that describes the anatomy of the things that are in it, the properties of how it's going to vary, the layout and spacing, accessibility concerns, content, text flow, all sorts of other details around behavior. It can be really detailed. And it really becomes the artifact that facilitates transition. And the reason for me the artifact becomes increasingly important is the more people that are going to use that as a reference. Even within a system, it can be 4 cross-functional assignees of subsequent steps that go across disciplines and are different people. And so, can we just automate this? Like, I wrote a plugin. I'm really proud of it. It's the most fun I've had in years. But like, can you just like select something in Figma, click a button, and have it do it all for you? I love Figma, but I don't understand why they still are making it so hard. Oh, a dev has to go into a mode and they still have to inspect like it's a big treasure hunt to find all the answers. Just make something and show them all the answers so they don't have to hunt for anything. So how can you think about your process and invest in the right tools to make it go more efficiently? Because designers don't have to do this. It can be done well with lots of great guesses. Or actually, they're not even guesses. It's a literal translation of what they made in Figma. And so I also use the spec for provisional agreement, the keyword there being provisional. As you do the work of coding and you do the work of creating your final publishable Figma assets, things can change and that's okay. But by the time you get to that spec handoff process, I'd say we're 90%, 80 to 90% agreed on what are we calling the things here highlighted in yellow. What are the names and variants and options of the props that we're going to have? And so this gives us a nice hook to have those conversations and align the work that's going to spread across multiple subsequent people. And so that isn't necessarily the first time I want developers to be engaged. And so it's up to me from a workflow perspective to precede the handoff with involving the developers in the critique of the evolving and starting to solidify design. Involving developers, if not actually, I require a developer to be in that planning session when we're 30 to 60 minutes talking through an Asana task to make sure that we have a decent, very low, drafty kind of sense of where we're going to go with this thing so that they can also have an influence on where the scope is going to go. But they get to the code step. And I'm not going to dig into code, but there's a similar way to think about all the things we do in code. There's a lot of tests that you need to run. You have to think about who they're going to share with and how reviews are going to work. But one thing I want to highlight here is that these steps, oh my gosh, there's so many different sub-steps. Do we have to do them all the time? No, this can take 5 minutes. Like, if you have a fix, You create a code branch, you change a line of code, you run your testing suite, which hopefully doesn't take 20 minutes because you have a really inefficient test suite. And then, guess what? You can have one other dev review it, and then you merge it with a little bit of words in your commit to understand what describe the change that you're making. And so just because you see a lot of potential steps doesn't mean you have to do a lot of potential steps. And these things can still move very quickly. The other thing is, notice in that make column, there's a draft API and obtain API feedback. To me, that is a healthy behavior that I see in developers to actually just scaffold up. What do you think it's going to look like? Your usage, your props, your slots, etc. As a first take. Like, you don't have to wait until the review process or VQA of a coded component to realize, wow, we've really diverged from where the design thought we were going to go, and that Figma asset is totally different now. Instead, how can we have artifacts that we inject in our process when they fit well for the task to have people expressing their own ideas? And how do we give developers a platform to respond to the architecture they're seeing from the design in a way that gives them the agency to also propose and evolve things? And so those moments I look for after handoff, and clearly there's a VQA moment where hopefully a designer is coming in and looking at the code. But also, I think about VQA across all those outputs too. Let's look at the design docs. Let's VQA the code docs and the examples I talked about before. And so how can I bring those people in multidisciplinary across all those different things before they all converge on this published asset or set of assets? Speaking of assets, Figma assets are increasingly important in the workflows that we do. You can also think about all the different things you need to do when you're making, testing, sharing, and reviewing Figma assets. I'm going to focus you in on just a couple of them. The first is, you plan Figma assets? Man, this thing's not that complicated. I'll tell you right now, it is complicated. Like, I understand that there's 4 different types of props in Figma, and I understand that how you make all of those things, and if you have missing values in all your cell and your big grid of Figma, there's all sorts of decisions in architecting those things that not all designers do perfectly. And I certainly don't do them perfectly when I make them either. And so when we're planning them, I actually have a set of components that are in Figma that mimic the Figma props panel, because you shouldn't be making Figma assets to express what the API and the props are going to be. That way you can take those assets and essentially say, okay, this is how these properties are going to get exposed. Here's how nested components are going to expose this, but not expose that. Here's what we're going to call the layer name, because that's what shows up in this panel. And so hopefully I'm getting designer and developer eyes on those proposed architectures, or even better, thinking about different alternatives and commenting on them. Are we sure we want states at that level? Could we actually, are we going to show or hide the description by default? And suddenly we're all thinking about the designer experience in Figma that hopefully is going to align with or be very close to the developer experience in code too. Also, you test Figma assets, oh my gosh, there are so many mistakes you can do with all these complicated nodes and attributes and props and all the different decisions that we make. And so while, yeah, you can probably make pretty simple components pretty quickly, you can also have, if you want, a way to think through a checklist of all the different things you can check. And I'm also particularly looking for content tests. How is the text flowing? What happens when I drag and resize something? Are these two things going to collide if the text gets too long? Yeah, I care about that level of precision, because these Figma assets, over time, I'm seeing in my own consulting, are transforming not into just a thing designers reuse, but a thing that system teams are using to automate specs and lint across platforms. And so these kinds of very small decisions in Figma assets are going to matter more and more over time. And so all the checklists, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff to think about. This is overwhelming. Yes, there are a lot of potential things you can do across steps, as you see in this spreadsheet. Each of the columns corresponds to one of the steps that you could do, and each of the rows corresponds to that model of starting and making and testing and presenting or sharing and then reviewing and delivering. But the reality is, no team does all these things. And it also creates a good framework for us to talk about the things we do already, the things we know we're not going to do soon. And so there's a set of yellow things in the middle that let's talk about it. Do we need to improve our process? Do we need to make it more robust? And if we're a team of 1, it's okay if you don't do all these things. But if you're a team of 35 people making a multi-framework design system for folks, that kind of rigor is going to become more and more important for you to be efficient and complete in your work. And so, speaking of many libraries, as you think about the design and code libraries, it's plural? You're producing many of them? Yeah, actually, it's pretty typical on the designer side that you're producing a Figma library these days, if that's the tool that you're using, which almost everybody is. But on the code side, you have things like React and iOS and Android. And sometimes those things are being done in sync with your team, and other times they're being done independent of your team. And so the kinds of questions I'm looking to ask are, well, how many code libraries are we going to implement? What framework is each going to be built with? And actually, what version of what framework? What team or teams is going to support each one? How connected are those teams with the central team or the team responsible for the design? And are we going to sync the releases of those different libraries or not? And it turns out that, yes, there is a federated dream to make many libraries. IBM did it. It still exists today. And when you look at IBM Carbon as a design system, it's incredibly impressive. Around 2022, I went into GitHub where all these libraries were made, and I started to look at how old is each of these libraries. There's a vanilla HTML and CSS one. I don't know if that's still supported now. There's React, but there's also Angular, Vue, Svelte, Web Components, and IBM.com. All independent libraries, all referencing the same design solution, and all supported by core maintainers. But there's also other contributors. And when I say other contributors, I mean people that are making very significant enhancements or components themselves. And then there's this massive community of small fixes. You can imagine just a line of code, or like they've contributed once, it's a couple lines of code. Look at the quantity, I'm gonna add that up, 110, 160, you know, there's about 240 or something like 220 different like contributors across all of those different libraries. This is a federated dream. Nobody else I've ever seen be able to do this well. So you don't have to look at this to think that that's success to you. And I actually had the privilege to talk to these folks a couple of weeks ago, and they've elevated web components to be centrally managed. So it's essentially above that dashed line now too. And so it still continues to evolve. They still have this kind of success. But at other companies, these models are not necessarily all the same and not always successful. On the far left, if you've got a simple model, that might mean that you're just producing a React code library. In this B column, you might have React or Angular CSS and web components, but they're all made by the same dev team, responsible for three sort of interconnected beasts. In the middle column C, you might have three dev teams. This is pretty typical for me these days. React, iOS, and Android, for example. And then column D is different because two of those dev teams for iOS and Android aren't under my managed essentially responsibility. They're just other teams. They tend to work for the big app, the main app, even though a company might make a bunch of other apps. It's the main app in iOS and Android, and they're making the library too. And so it's more disconnected. And that becomes this reality that with more and more libraries, your connectedness, your ability to sync releases, your parity of features across libraries, the rituals you share, they all start to decline and become a lot harder. Even to where you get to E, which is no code for your design system. And I'll come back to that. And so one of the things that actually really worked well was per component in our Figma library, let's make a version history. Let's describe the changes, because the iOS and the Android developers are like, you keep changing stuff, you keep putting it out in React, but we're only gonna revisit this 6 months later or 9 months later. We want to know what the gap is since we last visited this code so we can improve the button or the alert or whatever it might be. And so our version history also links to an old archived branch, and they can click into it. And actually we use 3 different colors: green for an addition, red for a deletion, and orange for a change, much like essentially a code diff. But it's like a spec diff. And so we just highlight with our specs an outer stroke of all those different parts of the spec. So for that change, they can immediately look at what actually changed in the definition of the component. It's actually really simple because we merge the branch, we remove all the colors, and then the main branch, it just looks like a clean spec. But now we have these essentially pointers to older versions of the spec that look like code diffs, essentially kind of the language they're used to as developers. Another thing that I've used are dashboards so that I can track the status of work. In the same example where we have an iOS library and an Android library, and I'm actually not responsible for managing the implementation of each of the components in those, they'll have their code tasks, they'll have sprints assigned to them, And then it was important for me to say, okay, well, once you're done with the code, how can we have a central design system designer come in and VQA that? And this is on the iOS side exhibiting, we were pretty much done doing all of those. On the Android side, it's sort of in progress, and we have this sort of trailing effect. How can we at least sync it so we know when the alert component's gonna come? Because that's gonna take some time for our designer to do that VQA. In addition, there's a third whole team, accessibility, that's required for both those libraries. And so how are they going to be responsible for making sure that's done? Because I want to see it here because I care about projecting our React, iOS, and Android libraries are all meeting the accessibility criteria. I want to be able to see it too. But there's actually another set of product managers that care too, because ultimately the people that control those developers' time are the project managers for those two main apps, and they want to see those things integrated into the apps themselves. And so we had to strongly distinguish the library work from their integration into their app work. And ultimately, success for all of us together was being able to see, in the iOS case, it's all done, and see in Android what lied ahead for, I want to say, 2, 3, 4 months into the future of how they were going to have to reintegrate or integrate for the first time each of the components they had. But this dashboard was success because getting to released integrated stuff in the main apps is what the stakeholders that control everybody's time cared about. Now, if you don't have code libraries, here's my broken heart. Amy hadn't seen it before when she gave the talk, so I'm another broken heart here. If you don't have code that you're producing, ultimately you do have a lot of different product teams that are taking your design assets and still implementing off it. And so, yeah, design systems without code, they still have value. It's still okay. You can make docs, you can serve your design community in a really helpful, cost-effective, value-rich way. But maybe it's for those other teams, you have to show them your specs. Maybe your specs need to be good because everybody's implementing your components. That totally stinks. I don't want it to be like that. But for one client that I otherwise really loved working with, that was our reality. And so we worked with a lot of developers bottom up. Our support channel was full of questions from those development teams. And we were waiting for the moment to pounce on a next major change to say, this is really hard, development organization. How can we use reusable code to help with the work? So as we get through all those libraries, we need to sync those things into a release when we've got our design or hopefully also code available as library assets that are well documented, and we need to communicate the changes to all the people that use them. And so when I'm thinking about release plans, I'm thinking about each release and each feature that we're slotting into each release, and my own mental model is, and for each feature, we have all the tasks that we need to check off. And so in this case, maybe you're doing monthly releases and you might have a card, a partial takeover, secondary accent colors, new icons, and error messaging that's gonna go out in August. And then in September, we're gonna have 3 more features. And then in October and November, we have a little looser sense of what's gonna go in there. But we have at least this plan for releases over time. And this kind of structure gives us a good way to think about the tasks that need to be done and the features we're going to release. And showing it in this doneness matrix format is something that's very clear. I've already shown the slide from iOS and Android. This is an example that's in a physical, or was in a physical space in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where Target was making their design system. It was right next to the elevators, and it enabled designers that cared about stuff that was getting done and when do I get this thing, and the design system team to say, here's where we're at, here's when you can expect it. And so we try to take a tool like Asana to reflect those things. And sometimes I have to manually do it, and it's worth my time to do so because this release board, here a release highlighted in green, has columns for each of the steps, and we can see this progression towards readiness to do the release itself. And so once we approach that time, there's also how are we going to communicate it? And so I'm thinking, well, one of the things for every release is we need to announce it. We need things that go out on Slack. Maybe you have a Slack design channel, a Slack dev channel. We're also going to use email. Let's back up from that moment to let's scope what we're going to talk about. Let's draft it. Let's get the copy final. Let's get the images that go along with the copy final. Let's VQA it. And actually, this is a very concrete 2-week process that we repeat every time at one of my clients. But it also fits within a range of other things we need to do, because that release announcement is the thing that goes out last. And it's my responsibility to make sure that as these things cascade down, that is preceded by the documentation site being published, like clicking publish in zeroheight, which is preceded by all of the assets themselves being published onto code registries, being published as Figma assets and so on, which is preceded by the library in Figma, because people can go to the main library, also updating its own version history and sticker sheet and descriptions of components and all that stuff in there too. Each one of these little circles is a task. And actually, we went through a process. There's 54 of them. We can just take a template in Asana, instantiate the release tasks. They're all pre-assigned to existing team members, and then maybe we prune a task, maybe we reassign a task. But it's actually very clear, and everybody knows what they need to do, and those small subtasks show up on each of the individual boards for people to do. Also, from a high level, I'm thinking about initiatives. It's not all feature development. When I talk about initiative, it's a set of scope. It's a bunch of tasks that are driving towards outcomes and are going to produce outputs to solve a problem within a defined period of time. Teams call them epics, missions, initiatives. I don't care. What's your language? I'll adopt whatever you want to call these things in your product org. And so one of them might look something like, we're going to tackle modality. How do we help teams implement diverse modal behaviors within web and native to quickly inform, gather data, and progress users through complicated workflows? And so the outputs feel like components, modals, partial takeovers, bottom sheets, elevation, etc. This one's definitely going to have some UX patterns associated with it. We're also going to need to produce some playgrounds, have some training, and work with key adopters to get it integrated into a few products to ensure we're doing it correctly. And so from a modality perspective, that's an example of one of many different types of initiatives. The one in the middle, feature development, we almost always do. Like, we're going to make more components. We're going to continue evolving our tokens, et cetera. We're going to make some UX patterns that are just in our backlog. But there are all these other missions or initiatives like composability or a new token taxonomy or improving dev support that we also want to tackle. And as I think through each of these, we should be able to succinctly describe them, even if we're thinking through things like not just the problem statements, outcomes, and outputs, but what are our opportunities, what are our risks, what are our stakeholders, what kind of steps are we going to go through to approach this, how are we going to deliver it, and plan that delivery process. Because if at a much higher level, these are our big bets for our design system. And as we have moments, let's say every year, every half year, maybe every 18 or 24 months, we're going to have to describe all the big things we could do and start getting stakeholder feedback here summarized by rows. Little thumbnail, little problem statement, gather data from, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 stakeholders, and start to see the trends on what people perceive you need. Start to expose the range of opportunities to them so they can say, I really wanted A, but I actually see now that B and C are more important, and get all of that feedback aggregated. This is a much deeper sort of talk that Jules Forrest from Credit Karma, one of the clients that I worked with, I love Jules, she's awesome, gave a talk. And if you're interested in this kind of road mapping and getting feedback from your community, you can go on YouTube and just search for schema, Jules, and probably community feedback, and you'll come up with this talk. And it's a really great talk. You have to love spreadsheets too. So if you like spreadsheets in this work, this is your jam. But all this stuff goes into a roadmap. We have, let's say for a particular period of time, we're pursuing feature development, web and native parity in our props and architecture, charts, and composability. Maybe those are our active all the work. And so somebody that I'm reporting to is typically asking, well, what's going on with all of our big bets? They ask that, let's say, less routinely, maybe every 2 weeks or every 6 weeks or what have you. But there is a place within Asana for me to make sure in the architecture of all my data, I've got my active initiatives, I've got my inactive initiatives. I can clearly say to the stakeholder, we're not working on charts right now. It's not the priority. And then within each of those initiatives, there might be a description, but frankly, that matters less. It's more about how discovery tasks to help us understand the overall mission are going to give way to all the features that ultimately we're going to deliver. And there's a way in that Asana or Jira architecture for us to highlight those things and also look across those things to see their relative impact, their relative size, and so on. And so my mental model, the stuff that's going on in Nathan's brain as I'm coming to work every day is I actually have all these initiatives that I need to take care of. And each of those, I'm going to probably be delivering them across many releases. each of which are actually mixing with other initiatives. So partial takeover is from modality, but we're also working on card independently, and all of those are structured to deliver with tasks. And so this kind of model is pretty repetitive and easy for me to work with, and it's all visible to the organization. So when I'm looking at Asana or I'm coming to Jira or what have you, I want to make sure I'm modeling the system work in a way that from a yellow product manager, project manager orientation, the roadmap and releases at a high level also provide the place for designers and developers to track their progressing work. And so that's important to me because I'm looking at the rituals I'm responsible for. Maybe it's design stand-up and the planning, and I'm also working with a dev lead and they have their stand-up. But we know that we're also intermixing. We know where our data is. We know that we have similar models of organizing the work, and we also can essentially carve out the responsibilities that each of us have to meet regularly to get this stuff done. One of the favorite things that I try to norm on teams is having a place to put the stuff we need to talk about. And so each of the boards that we have, really at the very top, have we call it to be prioritized at one client, just the bucket that when we meet next, we need to talk through those things. So for designers, we might have a stand-up every 2 times or 1 time or 5 times a week, but anybody can put stuff in the to be prioritized bucket, and cleaning that out is important for us to finish the meeting. And so that also gives us a great way to model how we're doing intake. And so dev intake and design intake, oftentimes those buckets are collectors of those things being things like defects, support requests, feature requests, contribution proposals, what have you. They come in from different sort of channels or collectors, and we need to know how to route them into the work that we do. And to me, that is, okay, what board are they going to land on? Sometimes if they're dev specific and small, or they're design specific and small, they just land in the to be prioritized. Or if there's a trafficker, maybe I'm one of the traffickers on the design side, we know it, we need to do it, it's tiny, just put it in ready to start so we can do it today or tomorrow. But there's also stuff that's going to flow, particularly not just feature requests and proposals of contributions, but also some defects that are going to be relevant across design and dev. And so how do we get that into a place where we can talk about that across teams? And for us, it might be the releases board, because we talk about that once a week as an anchor of our conversation. And so those end up getting assigned to releases or initiated into more work, or we just decide to put it in a backlog or delete it. And so as you think about your workflows, it might not match this exact model. You might not have the same kind of boards, but you might be able to tailor this in a way so that you know how the work is being routed through all of this stuff. And I hope this is the kind of thing that you can leave with inspiration as you think through all of the steps that are involved in your design system team's work and the workflows and your relationships with other teams that you need to interact and collaborate with. And I hope you have some practical takeaways. So have a great time at Converge. It's been a pleasure talking with you and workshopping with you a couple days ago. And we'll hopefully talk to you soon outside. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was amazing.